Be here with you guys. I've really been looking forward to this. As Jeff said, my name is Philip. I'm with Foster the City. Foster the City really is just at its essence, honestly, just a group of churches like InsideOut that are moving towards kids and families in foster care. And I'm excited to share more about this with you. I'm actually stoked to have a conversation with you that actually ties, I think, really well to one of your core values as a church. He's talking about serve compassionately. Today, I want to talk about the remarkable compassion of God. Remarkable compassion. That's what I kind of titled today's talk. And so today what I want to do is I want to take a long, lingering look at the remarkable compassion of God and look at the compassion that God is calling you and me into as his followers towards the vulnerable, towards those in need around us in Echo Park, in LA, and around the community. Before we're done today, too, I'll give you a handful of really practical, powerful ways that you can actually get engaged with kids and families around you in need as well. So we'll tackle that. But just so we're on the same page right at the gate, let me tell you what I mean when I say the remarkable compassion, or when we talk about serve compassionately. Look, if you look at that word compassion, you break it down. You have calm, C-O-M, and then you have passion, right? Passion means to suffer. Right? Like the passion of the Christ, right? Passion means to suffer. Calm, C-O-M, like community or communal, it means with. So to suffer with, that's what compassion means. It means to be with those who are in need, to be with those who are suffering, to actually move towards them, not move away like we are so inclined, but to actually move towards those who are suffering and in need. That's what, again, compassion means. And this is something that is incredibly near to the heart of God, isn't it? And because it's near to the heart of God, it's near to the heart of Jeff and Katie and the leadership here, but it's near to the heart of this church. In fact, if you open up the scriptures, Genesis to Revelation, Old Testament, New Testament, it's clear God loves every person on this planet, every person across Echo Park. God loves every man, woman, and child, right? For God so loved the world. Well done. But it's also clear when you open up the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, that there are some people that make the top of God's list. There are, again, you look at it, Old Testament, New Testament, there are some people that have a special place in God's heart. And it's the orphan, it's the widow, it's the sojourner or the immigrant, and it's the poor. You see it all throughout the Bible. Right? So in other words, it's those who are far from family, those who are far from home, those who have suffered deep loss, those who are without protection, those who are vulnerable. They have a special place in God's heart. I'll take you to just one quick scripture. Psalm 82, it says this. It says, defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, rescue the weak and the needy. That is one of dozens and dozens and dozens of scriptures all throughout the Bible that make it so crystal clear what God's heart is towards the vulnerable. And because that is a defining characteristic of God, the remarkable compassion has been a defining characteristic of God's people since the very beginning, for the last 2,000 years. There's a lot you could say about the church over the last 2,000 years. Some positive, some not so positive. But here's one thing you can say, is that time and again, God's people have moved, they've entered into places of injustice and brokenness and sorrow, and it brought healing and hope, time and again. Did you know that the first known hospital in every nation across the globe was started by the church? Isn't that cool? If you look at education reform, prison reform, women's rights, the abolition of slavery, of course, civil rights, they all trace their roots back to the church, back to the people of God. Because this is what we do. The same is true with the care of vulnerable kids. Let me tell you about a guy named Charles Brace. Anybody here heard of Charles Brace? Probably not. Charles Loring Brace, born in the 1800s in the northeastern part of the U.S., he grew up in a Christian home, placed his faith in Jesus at a real young age, was sitting in church, just like you are today, listening to a message from a pastor, and this pastor said something that just became this defining moment in his life. So I'm going to paraphrase here, okay? So bear with me. But this is basically what the pastor said. Really helped to shape the trajectory of Charles's life. The pastor said, you know, when we stop to consider all that God has done for us when we were in need, when we see those in need around us now, it's impossible for us to believe we don't have at least some level of responsibility to do something. I kind of butchered that. Can I say it again? Okay. When we stop to remember all that God has done for us when we were in need, all the grace and the compassion that he's poured out onto us when we were in need, when we were in distress, it's impossible for us to believe that we don't have at least some level of obligation to do something when we see those in need around us. That just made a lot of sense to Charles. So a few years went by. He would end up in New York City studying to become a pastor. Was in Bible school, in seminary. And one day, in his mid-20s, he's in seminary. He takes a walk through the streets of New York, walks into a neighborhood called 5 Points. Have you heard of 5 Points? 5 Points at the time, have you seen Gangs of New York? It's okay. Can you admit that here? Are we allowed to admit that? Okay. All right. That took place in 5 Points. 5 Points at the time was known for its crime and its poverty and its prostitution and its gang violence. And so when he walked into that neighborhood, he said that his heart just melted. His heart broke because what he saw in front of him were a whole bunch of kids, children, living in these really unhealthy, broken environments. And so when he walked in that day, his mind went back to what his pastor had said. And he's like, man, in light of all that God has done for me when I was in need, I have to do something with what I'm seeing. And so he did. He got some of his buddies together, and they started with, they called it the Children's Aid Society, which, by the way, 150 years later is still going. And the Children's Aid Society started all kinds of programs that dealt like at a root systemic level with what they were seeing in front of them in 5 Points and in these neighborhoods of New York. So they started the first ever free school lunch programs for kids. They started schools for kids who were disabled. They started the first free dental clinics for kids. Get this. They started the first ever PTA. Anybody been a part of the PTA? You can blame Charles for that one. Okay? They started the first ever Parent Teachers Association, PTA. But most notably, they started what we call here in America foster care. They would help these kids who were living in these really broken, unhealthy environments find a stable home to live in while their birth families, their biological families, did what they needed to do to create a healthy environment, and then the families were reconciled back together. They were restored back together. So follow me. I want to make sure you hear me. Foster care was started by a Christian. Foster care was started by a pastor with the motivation that in light of all that God has done for us when we were in need, now we get to do the same for those around us. Isn't that cool? Guys, that's the legacy of the church. That's the legacy of God's people. That's the torch that we get to carry on today. And honestly, the care of vulnerable children goes back even further than that for God's people. Some of you might already be aware of this, but we actually have historical records that tell us about this early Roman tradition. When a child would be born into a Roman family, they would often do this tradition where they would place the child down at the feet of its dad. And in this tradition, when the dad stooped down and picked up the child into his arms, big celebration, child was legitimized, welcomed into the family. It was a great day. Okay? That's actually, by the way, where we get the term raising our kids. It's from that Roman tradition. The problem is, sometimes the dad didn't stoop down and pick up the child. Maybe the child was sick. Maybe the child wasn't the preferred gender of that day. But if for whatever reason the dad didn't pick up the kiddo, instead they would take the child outside of the city and be left alone to die. It's a completely legal, common, acceptable practice. They called it infant exposure. But we also have records that tell us how early followers of Jesus responded to that. We have records that tell us how followers of Jesus would go outside of the city at night and they would walk up and down the streets listening for the cries of kids. And when they'd find these kids, they'd bring them back into their own homes and they would raise them up as their own sons and daughters. Guys, this is the legacy of the church. This is the remarkable compassion that the people of God have been showing our vulnerable neighbors for year after year after year after year. And what I'm stoked about, the reason I'm stoked to be here today, Inside Out, is because we have the opportunity to carry on that same torch today. My wife and I started fostering kiddos like 8 or 9 years ago. Man, it's been a long time. 8 or 9 years ago now we started. And honestly, like our hearts just were breaking as these kids were coming into our home. When our hearts were breaking for their families that were falling apart. And at the time, I was pastor in a small church. And so shortly into our kind of fostering journey, I stood in front of the congregation and we invited our church to join us. And we just said, hey, what if we were to find ways to move towards kids and families that are falling apart in our community together? What if we were to find some ways to do that together? And so we brought out some social workers and we started conversations with these social workers and started discovering some ways that we could get involved. And as we built relationships with these social workers, at one point they sat down with me. And this one woman, she said, Philip, we like working with your church. She said, but the reality is right now we are in an emergency crisis. That was a phrase she used. We are in an emergency crisis. And she said, honestly, the crisis is just a little bit bigger than your church. She said, do you think that there are other churches that would want to work with us too? And the challenge that she put out, she said, would you guys consider starting a faith alliance? That was a phrase she used. And I was like, well, what's a faith alliance? Like, tell me what you mean by that. And she said, are there other churches that would want to come and link arms? She started to tell us about how there were more kids coming into foster care than there were homes and families ready to help them. And she started to describe to me about what would happen about kids being sent out of our communities and how we're losing a little bit of our community every time that happens. And about how much more difficult it is for families to be reconciled back together when kids are being sent, counties and counties away because of a deficit of homes. So that's where I was here in California, different part of California, up in the Bay Area. But I was just talking with Pastor Jeff. The Bay Area pales in comparison to the need that you have here. That same invitation was extended right here in Los Angeles County. You might know this, but LA County manages the largest population of foster youth in the entire country. Do you know that? Do you know that there are more kids in foster care in this county, in LA County, than in any entire state in the country? Literally, there are thousands and thousands of children being sent out of LA because of a deficit of foster homes. When the social worker came and they asked me, would you consider doing this, we came back and we said, I'm a lot of things. I'm a dad. I'm a coffee drinker. I'm a Warriors fan. I got booed one time when I said that. There you go. I got some thumbs down. I'm a lot of things. I hope that at the deepest, truest part of who I am is that I'm a follower of Jesus. And part of what that means, none of this is in my notes, so sorry. But part of what it means to follow Jesus is to listen to what he says and to follow him in his commands. Follow him in the way that he lived his life. And one of his most fundamental commands to us was to love our neighbor. And it breaks my heart that there is somebody in some other part of California or some other part of the country having to love my neighbor. There's something fundamentally broken about that. These are your neighbors. Up in the Bay Area, those are my neighbors. We have an obligation to them, a responsibility to them. So I say that about 8 years ago now, we got this invitation to start rallying churches together. Guys, it's been one of the greatest privileges and gifts of my life, one of the greatest joys of my life, watching the way leaders like Jeff and Katie, watching the way churches like InsideOut have responded to that invitation to start moving towards kids and families in crisis. Today, we started with one little church. We were meeting in a little senior center at the time as a little church. What started with a tiny little congregation meeting in a senior center today is 272 churches up and down the state of California moving towards kids and families, calling their congregations to open up their hearts and their homes to kids, calling their congregations to stand with one another, to bear each other's burdens and share each other's joys as we are moving towards the vulnerable in our community. And I'm here hoping that perhaps God might be calling some of you to consider how you might play a role in that. So with the rest of kind of the time that I have, which I have no idea how much time that is, but with the rest of the time that I have, I want to share with you three reasons why I think we've been seeing so many families and so many churches saying yes and moving towards these kids and families that have been breaking down. 3 reasons why I think they're saying yes, and then I want to lay out for you 4 ways that you can be involved. That sound good? That's where we're headed the next few minutes. All right, here's the first reason why I think we're seeing churches say yes. Because we believe, and this is true for you too, because you believe every person has intrinsic value. Every person matters to God. Every man, woman, and child. Across Echo Park, across LA, across California, across the world. Guys, in the book of Genesis, we all know it says we were created in the image of God. His fingerprint is on each one of us. The book of Ephesians 1, it says that he spoke us forth from before the foundation of the world. That's what Ephesians 1 says. Stop and think about that for a minute. He spoke you forth from before the foundation of the world. Do you know what that means? That means that the moment when your mom and your dad came together and put you into being, it's gross to think about, but stay with me. When that moment of your conception, when your mom and your dad came together, that was second in your story. What came first was that you were birthed in the heart of God before time and space began. That's what Ephesians 1 is talking about. He spoke you forth from before the foundation. You have intrinsic value. You were birthed in the heart of God before the universe existed. Book of Isaiah says that we are precious to God in his sight. Isn't that crazy? We're precious to God. I have a buddy. His name is Krish. He is a foster dad. He got a call for a kid who needed a placement. And he already had kids in the home, and so he's on the phone with the social worker, and he's like, I've already got a kiddo. I've already got kids in the home. Can you tell me a little bit more about this child before I say yes? I want to make sure that he's going to be a good fit for my family. And so they said, well, we don't know much about him. He's brand new to the system. We know one thing, though. We know he's a biter. My buddy's like, well, what does that mean? Like, what is he biting? Are we talking food? Are we talking about animals? Are we talking about people? Like, what does he bite? And he's like, I'm not sure I want to take in a biter. But he said as soon as that thought hit him, all of his theology started flooding back into his mind. And he said, then I realized that the term biter is an incomplete description of a child. Biter is an inadequate, incomplete description of a human being. Because you are more than the worst things you've ever done. Right? Guys, and you're more than the worst things that have been done to you. Which, by the way, set foster care aside for a minute. You might have needed to just get up and get to Inside Out just because you needed to hear that one thing. That's just for, you are more than the worst things you've done. And you're more than the worst things that have been done to you. God loves you. He values you. He cares about you. You are precious to him. You were birthed in the heart of God before time and space began. He loves you. And he didn't just, that's not just ink on a page. That's not just something in a book somewhere. That's not just something we sing about. It's true. He proved it, didn't he? God proves his love for us in this. He demonstrates his love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He died for you. He loves you. That brings me to the second reason then why I think we're seeing people say, why we're seeing churches move towards kids and families. Is because we know that their story is our story. These kids and families who are in need, like that's our story. I may be a little bit biased here, but there may be no time in your life when you are more like God than in the times when you open up your life to someone in need. Because that's what he did for us, didn't he? There was a time in my life when I was hurting and felt alone and broken, and I thought because of all of the wounds from my past that I had lost like any hope for my future. But when I was at my lowest and my darkest place, like God met me there, and he brought me into his family. Is that your story too? Again, going back to Ephesians 1, you mind putting that up? Ephesians 1, I think it's verse 5. Look at this. This is one of my favorite verses in all the Bible. It says, God decided in advance to adopt us into his family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. This is one of the most beautiful verses in all of the Bible. Please, I beg you. I know that I don't know most of you. I don't know your stories. I don't know. Maybe some of you have been coming to Inside Out for a while. Maybe this is for some of you, this is like your first time, or you've been here exploring for a little bit. Who is Jesus? Is there a God? What is church all about? What is faith all about? Listen, maybe you're even at the place, okay, even if there is a God, would he want someone like me? Even if there is a God out there, after all the things I've done, all the places I've been, time and time again, would he even want somebody like me? If that's you today, I beg you to read this verse. Not only is God willing to welcome you into his family, he wants to. He wants to. It would bring him great pleasure to welcome you in as his daughter or as his son. This is our story. When we were in need, God brought us in. As a foster dad, I feel like I get little glimpses of the truth of this. The fact that it brings God pleasure to welcome us in his family. I feel like I've got to be able to taste just a little bit of that. The most recent little one that we brought her in when she was 2.5 months old. We got the chance to foster this little girl for about 4 years. We absolutely fell in love with her. This little girl's story was a little bit different than the kids we'd fostered in the past. The kids we'd all fostered in the past had gone back home. They were restored back with their family, which again, in foster care, that's whenever possible, that's the goal. We were talking about this as a leadership team before this. Like, we've been given what the Bible says, the ministry of reconciliation. We get a chance to partner with God and help him to restore families together in health. That's, whenever possible, we want to see families come back together. Sometimes that's not possible. For this little girl that we brought in, fostered for 4 years, we were told partway into her journey she was not going to have a home to go back to. And so after 4 years of fostering, we got the chance to move from being her foster family to her forever family. We got the chance to adopt her. I actually think we have a picture. Do we have a picture, possibly, maybe? It's all right. She's super cute, though. She's super cute. Yeah, if we don't have her, no worries. You just trust me. Think about like a really cute little girl, and then just like double it. But this little girl, her name is Lucy. She's 6 years old now. She's almost 7. And the name Lucy means light. That's what she's been to our family. She's been an absolute source of delight and joy. The girl never stops smiling. When I think, so every morning she comes out in her little night dress, nightgown thing, and there's this chair that I sit and do my quiet time in our family room every morning. And so my daughter comes and waddles out of her room every morning and comes and totally interrupts me, and it's the best thing. And when I think about the way that I look at that little girl as she comes out of her room and comes and crawls up into my lap, and the joy and the love that I feel for that little girl, when I think that God sees me in that same way, that he experienced that kind of pleasure and that kind of delight, that he has that for me, isn't that incredible? But listen, when God brings us into his family, it comes with delight and joy and pleasure, but it also came with something else, didn't it? It came with sacrifice. For God to bring us into his family, it brought joy, but it also required sacrifice. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, right? There's joy and a cross. Anytime you and I show remarkable compassion, there will always, always, always be a cost involved. When people hear people hear about Foster the City, or they hear that we foster and adopt kids, we'll oftentimes hear the same thing. They'll be like, "Oh, that's so cool that you guys do that. I could never do that." They're like, isn't it hard? Like, what if the kids that come into your home, what if, because of maybe some of the things they've walked through in the past, some of the trauma, what if they act out of that? What if they misbehave? What if their behavior issues, attitudes? Isn't that hard? You want to know the answer to that? Yes, it's hard. Here's the reality. We all act out of the trauma that we've gone through in our life. Every person in this room. You act out of the trauma, the hard things that you've experienced in your life. The reality is, these children have oftentimes gone through more trauma than you and I ever have. And so will they act out? Sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes that's a challenge. And then on the flip side, people will say, but what about what if you fall in love with them? Isn't that hard? They're with you for months, maybe years, and then they become like your own flesh and blood. They become like your own son or your own daughter, and then you get a call, and then just one day they get picked up and go back home, and you never see them again. Isn't that difficult? Do you want to know the answer to that? Yeah, absolutely. We are not cold-hearted robots. Absolutely, it's hard. The first little girl we brought into our home, we brought her, and she was 4 months old. We had her for just under a year. I absolutely fell in love with her. She took her first steps in my living room. Her first words were calling me Dada. She called my wife Mama. She called me Dada first, though. I will say that. But we absolutely fell in love with this little girl. She very quickly became a sister to my biological kids. I have 3 biological kids. She became a sister to them. But in that year that we were falling in love with this little girl, we were also getting to know her biological parents. There was a reason, they made some mistakes. There was a reason why their daughter was with us. But they're doing everything that they possibly could to bring their little girl back home. So after about a year or so, the judge gave the green light, and I remember handing this little girl back into the arms of her dad at my front door. My oldest son told me it was the first time he'd ever seen me cry. Now I cry all the time. But we wept that day. And the next day, by the way. Of course it hurts. Guys, but we don't show compassion because it makes us feel good. We have a friend, he says, you don't foster to get a child for your family. You foster to give your family to a child. You see the difference? But if we are willing to do that, if we are willing to experience and embrace both the pleasure and the delight that comes when you show compassion and the sacrifice and the cost and the cross in it all, it's incredible to think about the impact that we can make. And that's brings me to our third kind of final core reason why I believe the church is saying yes to kids and families. Because we know that our investment in the lives of the vulnerable can bring a long-term impact. Here's what I mean. Even if you have no experience at all in child welfare or walking with kids who come from hard places, kids who grow up without a stable, healthy environment are far more susceptible to all kinds of other issues as they get older. So for example, about half of the kids who age out of the foster care system in their 20s, they'll be unemployed. About a third will spend time on the streets. About half will develop a substance addiction. More than half will have PTSD. Do you know you're actually twice as likely as a kid in foster care to have PTSD than a war veteran that's experienced active combat? Think about that for a minute. You are twice as likely as a kid in foster care to have PTSD than a soldier that's been shot at because of all that these kids have gone through. Suicidal tendencies for kids in foster care are 4 times higher than the average youth. The FBI did a study. They said that 60% of the kids that they're rescuing from human trafficking here in the States come directly from the foster care system. I could spend the rest of our time just going through stats. But here's what we realized. We need right now more organizations, like IJM and these different organizations that are banging down, the doors and rescuing men and women who are being trafficked right now. We need more churches and organizations and individuals that are dealing with homelessness and unemployment and, substance addiction and all of these other things that I just talked about, right when people are in it. But what if in addition to that, you also go upstream and you care for the kids before they ever enter into those issues? What would the stats look like in LA if every single child that entered into foster care today would immediately be placed into a loving home? What would stats look like in 20 years? Again, this is an upstream approach. What would the stats look like in 20 years if every single child that came into foster care today was immediately placed into a loving, Christ-centered, stable home? We say this all the time. It sounds like a cheesy little mantra, but it's not. We say the best way to see a transformed city tomorrow is if we care for vulnerable kids today. And my hope and my prayer is that God might be calling some of you to be a part of that, to be able to go and overflow, be able to actually extend what God has done for you into the lives of your neighbors around you. And so in just a minute, I want to share 4 quick ways that we can do that. But if we can, let's go ahead and try that video. I want to be able to actually hear a story of a family whose life was changed. If we have that video able to work here.
I remember taking my pipe and just putting it on the floor and just stepping on it. And I was like, I'm done. And I remember taking my pipe and just putting it on the floor and just stepping on it. And I was like, I'm done. And a month later, Madison was born on her due date, which I don't know how that happened because I had done everything you're not supposed to do while you're pregnant. And on the 3rd day, they took my daughter and they said, we'll be right back. And they never came back. I went down almost every street around the hotel and just cried and just didn't know where to go. And I didn't want to go back to the motel because I had my room in the motel all set up with a crib and clothes. I just felt so alone and lost.
I was advised to be cordial but confidential because the bio mom was hostile to the first foster parents, and so obviously not really what I wanted to hear. They said be confidential, so I thought, is it bad if she even knows my name? So when I met Lauren, I didn't know what to expect, but as soon as we started talking, she felt at ease with me.
I was on my first unsupervised visit with my daughter. I was feeling so nervous. I have my daughter, and we can go wherever we want, and we can be back at a certain time. We can spend this time alone that I haven't had. She goes in my car, and we're driving, and Madison starts crying. And she starts crying and crying and crying, and I start crying, and we're both holding each other, and we're just crying, and I knew she didn't want me. So I met them at Trader Joe's parking lot, and we're in the parking lot, and I'm just crying and holding Madison, and Brian puts his hands over me while I'm crying, and he just prayed for me. And I don't know what he said, but when he was done, all the guilt was taken away. All the guilt was taken away. Because when she was crying, it wasn't just a kid crying. All I heard was everything I did while I was pregnant. Everything I did to put her in a position to be crying.
Well, when we first got into foster care, or we thought we were going to start doing it, it was just, the focus was just all about the children and about, saving children. We didn't have any other really focus until we went to our agency's training, which was really good. And they kind of like enfolded us into the whole process of dealing with, there's a family that's broken, and you're there not just for the children, but there's an entire family that's out there that's going to be hurting.
Out of the blue, I got a text message from her, which made me cry. She had just texted me, Bethany, I need God and I want Madison to know Jesus. And I'm like, I called her right away. I was like, we gotta talk. I'm like, you're making me cry. She's like, why? And I'm like, because this is absolutely amazing. And then to hear how God has just been working on her heart, it was exciting. And she wanted to learn more. She's hungry and thirsty, and so we've been doing Bible study together. She started going to church. She found one. They got connected in there, and so it's been amazing to see God at work.
They were my support. Bethany and Brian were my main support throughout this whole case after they got Madison. They carried me. They believed in me. My relationship with them is still growing, and I love them so much. I consider them to be my family. I get my advice from Bethany. I watch her family because I want what she has, and I want what her family has, and I want how her family is. I want that for my family.
You think about walk by faith and not by sight. And going into fostering, we had a lot of questions. We had a lot of doubts, concerns, fear. There's a whole lot of emotions, and you almost don't want to do it, but you want to do it. And the things we feared most, I feel like didn't come to pass. We were so afraid that it would blow up on our faces and that it would be the worst experience ever for our family. And it hasn't been that way. I think we're always afraid to obey the Lord because we don't know what the cost will be. But in following Christ, the cost is always worth it. It really ends up being no cost. I'm like, we've gained more than had to, put out kind of thing. And God is always so gracious in that way. So, I don't know why we get so afraid. But yeah, we do. And we're going to continue to grow in those things. But God is so kind. He's so kind in his dealings with us.
Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, isn't that beautiful? Thank you. As I said earlier, this happened right here in your backyard, by the way. And there are thousands of kids, just like little Madison, and thousands of parents, just like Lauren, there in that story. And you hear numbers like that, and you're like, man, that just feels too big. It's easy to keep numbers like that at a distance. But we know, like, every number has a name, just like Madison. And every name has a story. Every story matters to God. And because their stories matter to God, their stories matter to us. So I want to tell you, as kind of wrap up here, just like 4 key ways that you can get involved. I'll make this real quick here, okay? Four practical, powerful roles that you could step into if you're interested in being a part of what's happening through Foster the City. And the first role is that of a foster parent. You could actually explore what it would look like to open up your home to a child in your community that is in need. So a foster parent simply cares for a child for a season temporarily while the biological family goes through a plan to be able to restore it back together. Bethany here, the foster mom, mentioned that the caseworker had said, hey, be a little bit careful about this bio mom. I don't know, did you guys catch that? Do you want to know the reason why she said be careful? Why this Lauren was hostile? Is because, according to Lauren, foster parents were just about taking people's babies. That this foster mom was going to try and adopt, take her child from her. But that was not the case at all. Bethany and Brian were all about standing with that mom in compassion, walking with her to be able to help restore that family back together. And once Lauren realized, oh man, Bethany's not trying to take my child, she's for me, that changed everything. And so we get the opportunity as foster parents to do that. And so that could be something that you could explore. A child typically enters into foster care because of neglect, or in some cases abuse, or some kind of other complex trauma. But because of the complexities and the difficulties of what they've walked through, to become a foster parent, you have to be trained and licensed through an agency. That is not Foster the City. We are not a training, licensing agency. We are simply a movement of churches calling our congregations to move towards vulnerable kids. However, one thing that we do offer is what we call a launch meeting. Okay, and at this launch meeting, you'll learn some of the nitty-gritty details of what it looks like to be a foster parent. What are some of the requirements and some of the mindsets you need to have. It's a great place to ask your questions. It's also an opportunity to hear from some experienced foster family panel. This is all done virtually. So you can jump on a Zoom call and attend this launch meeting. You'll also get kind of a snapshot of the different agencies that you could go through to experience your training and getting your license and all of that. So if you're interested in learning, just exploring what it might look like to foster, I want to invite you to take that commitment card there on your, that was right next to you there, and you can just check off that box that says foster parent, okay? Now, one question we do often get about this, about fostering is, who is right as a foster parent? Like, what season of life are you looking for? Is it young? Is it old? Is it single? Is it married? Really, it's all of the above. I'll give you just a few examples of that. We need single people to foster. We need single parents. So single people oftentimes think of themselves as disqualified from this, but honestly, we've seen some phenomenal singles step forward and welcome in kids. The reality is sometimes a kid will come into foster care, and maybe part of that is because of some abuse. Maybe they've been abused by a male figure. And so actually having a single mom actually open up their home to a child where there's not a male in the home could actually be a phenomenal environment for that child to heal and to feel safe. Okay, there's all kinds of benefits for a single person to actually open up their home, and there's all kinds of resources to be able to help you do that and start parenting. We need young marrieds. There's all kinds of benefits to actually start welcoming in children through foster care before you've even had your own biological children. We've actually experienced this personally. We brought in a child, and very quickly we realized it was actually not good for this child to have other kids in the home, but they really needed a singular focus of parents. And so these young marrieds got a chance to actually bring in this child and spend all of their time focusing on that one child. We need families with children in the home. Again, I've mentioned to you I have 3 biological kids as well. Having a child come into a home where there are kids in the home is oftentimes a benefit. It normalizes things for the child. And not to mention, by the way, and I wish we had more time, but the opportunities for character formation for my own biological children of being a foster dad and welcoming in kids has been absolutely priceless. I cannot tell you the ways that my kids have matured and grown, being that they've now been able to be a part of our fostering journey. Which, by the way, and again, I don't have time, my wife and I are 3rd-generation foster parents. I grew up as a brother that had foster kids coming in and out of the home. And I grew up, it was a huge part of my formation, and I said, I want to do that someday. I want to be able to care for my own neighbors in that same way. But finally, we also get asked about empty nesting. What about empty nesters? Are they right to be foster parents? And again, I'm just going to tell you, some of our most phenomenal foster parents are empty nesters. My own parents, as I said, fostered, and as I even got into their empty nesting years, my brothers and I were all kind of moving out of the house. They were looking at their retirement years, that next chapter for them. In their words, they say, we're getting closer to the finish line. Should we, just ride off into the sunset, do some travel, play some golf, kind of relax now? We've done our time for kingdom work. And they just said, no, that we want to, if anything, we want to run as hard as we can to that finish line. We want to finish strong. And so they brought in 3 young boys through foster care in their empty nesting years. I think of my friend Ann. My friend Ann is 75 years old. She came up to me after I preached at a church one day, and she said, Philip, I'm 75. There's no way I could be a foster mom. However, she said, I can be a foster grandma. And I was like, that's awesome, man. And so Ann became a support friend, which we'll talk about here in a minute, to a foster parent that was actually fostering a teenage boy. His name is James. And Ann built this really sweet relationship with this family and this boy, James. And James actually started calling her grandma. It's so sweet. And actually, it got to this place where James needed a different placement, a little bit closer to his high school so he could finish school. And Ann said, you know what? Maybe I can do it, because Ann lived right across from the high school. And so Ann brought James in, and she became not just his foster grandma, but his foster mom, 75 years old. Okay? We need people from all walks of life. It's so easy to think that we are disqualified for some reason, but we need folks from all seasons of life. That said, fostering is not for everybody. If that's you today, I want you to know there's another role that you can play. And one of those roles, we call it a support friend for a foster parent. So one of the primary reasons why there's a shortage of foster parents today is because foster parents don't last very long. Nationwide, more than half will drop out within their first year. You hear me? It's like nationwide, 50 to 60% will drop out within year 1. What changes that retention rate is if a foster family takes their journey in the context of community. There was a nationwide survey that pointed out that the number one reason why foster parents drop out is because they feel alone. So for every foster family that we're raising up in our churches, we're wrapping them with a team of 4 support friends that provide practical, emotional, spiritual support in their journey. Here's what a support friend is not. A support friend is not, oh, Jeff, cool, you guys are fostering? Great. Call me if you need me sometime. I would never hear from Jeff, right? Because nobody likes to ask for help. A support friend is somebody who is covenanted to that family during their journey. Right? So throughout the duration of a child's placement, they're there, they're consistent, they're committed. So they're showing up at least twice a month is what we ask of our support friends. One in a really practical way, like I'm showing up and I'm babysitting so that Jeff and his wife can go and get a date night and connect and kind of recharge and then go back into the fray. Maybe I'm showing up and I'm mowing a lawn. Maybe I'm bringing meals. Maybe I'm sending a DoorDash. I'm just showing up in really practical ways. And then a second is maybe a more supportive act of service. And maybe that's writing an encouraging note. Maybe it's sending a text. It's jumping on the phone. It's finding some ways to support them emotionally. Hey, so for every foster family, we try to raise 4 support friends who each try to connect with that foster family with practical acts of support 2 times a month. Make sense? So a support friend enables a foster family to foster longer and better. If you are interested in that role, you can just check off that box. Becoming a support friend is about 4 easy steps. Number 1, check off the box on this commitment card. Number 2, you attend a training. It's about an hour and a half long. Just kind of walks you through some of the qualifications and the mindsets and how you can really come alongside this family well. Number 3, you do a background check. We actually have a dual background check. We want to make sure that everybody we're wrapping, it's a safe and healthy connection there. And then 4th, you wait for your advocate to connect you to the right foster parent. That brings me to the 3rd role that you could step into. And be honest with you guys, even more than a foster parent, even more than a support friend, this is the role that I was praying for as I came to Inside Out. We call that role an advocate. We can't do any of this without this specific role. So the advocate is the ministry leader at the local church that actually cares for the foster families and the support friends, actually helps to train the support friends, get them connected to the family, provide accountability, provide support. They're the ones that really build the Foster the City ministry at each local church. So all of the 272 churches, Foster City is completely free of charge. We don't charge churches, we don't charge families or support friends. Everything is free, all our resources, everything. We also are all about Jesus. And so we don't take any money from the government, because as soon as you take any money from the government, that changes some things as far as your messaging and so on. So we want to keep this centered on Jesus and for him, and so we don't take any contracts from the government. That all said, Foster the City has mobilized, again, over 270 churches, hundreds of families, almost 1,300 support friends now, and we've seen hundreds and hundreds of children welcomed into Foster the City homes because of the generosity of individuals like you. And so if you are interested in partnering with Foster City financially, we want to invite you to join the neighborhood. That's what we call our team of monthly financial partners. Some give $20 a month, some give $200 a month. But basically, every dollar goes directly to the lives of vulnerable kids, helping us raise up families and care for them well. I will say this, though. Your first responsibility is to your local church. Your tithes and offerings go here to Inside Out to be able to help support the work of what's happening here. But if you feel compelled to go above and beyond and actually partner with Foster City, there's a way to do that as well. You can check off the box. Here's the deal. I gave you 4 roles as fast as I possibly could. You with me still? Okay. So take that commitment card, fill that out. There's a basket on the back table if you're interested in getting involved. And I promise you, you have my word. If you fill this card out, we will not drop a foster kid off to your house this afternoon. I swear. All we're going to do is we're going to follow up with you, whether it's with an email or connect you with a team member, depending on what it is. If you're and listen, we call this commitment card. That's a really misleading statement. You are not signing in blood. All you're simply doing is saying, I commit to the next step. I commit to wanting to learn more about the neighborhood or to learn more about that advocate role you're talking about. I'm committing to learn a little bit more about what it would actually look like to foster. That's what you're doing. So if you want it, you can just fill that out, drop it off in the basket in the back, and I close with this. Foster care is not for everybody. Breathe, everybody, okay? We're not all taking kids home today, all right? Foster care is not for everybody. However, if you are a follower of Jesus, remarkable compassion is for you. Like, that's not up for debate, actually. That's part of what it means to follow Jesus, is to live a life of remarkable compassion. Because Jesus lived a life of remarkable compassion. And as his followers, we follow in his footsteps. I began by telling you what the word compassion means. Let me tell you what the word remarkable means. Remarkable means you're able to remark on it. It's worth remarking on. So again, I'm in the Bay Area. I flew down last night. My wife asked, how was your flight? I said, fine. In other words, it was not remarkable. It wasn't worth talking about. Okay, so the opposite of remarkable is not bad. The opposite of remarkable is fine, typical. The life of compassion that you are called to and that I am called to is not meant to be fine or typical or average. It's meant to be remarkable. It's meant to be worth talking about. Because in Matthew 5, Jesus says, let your light shine before others that they might see your good deeds and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. So when the watching world looks into your life and looks at the way you spend your time and your resources and your gifts, they see the way that you are spending the few fleeting moments on this planet. Guys, it's so short. When they see the way that who this church is in this community, does it cause them to react and respond in some way? Does it cause them to elevate their eyes and be able to look to God? Because that's what we're called to do. We're called to live lives of remarkable compassion. Let me pray. God, I thank you so much again for this church. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, to be able to share about what you're doing. Thank you, Lord, for the chance to partner with amazing churches like InsideOut that care deeply for their community. God, I pray that you would stir in each one of our hearts. Give us the clarity and the courage to know how you might be calling us to move and and the courage to be able to follow you in your leadership, God. We pray that this area, God, Echo Park, the greater LA County would never be the same as a result of what you're doing in and through InsideOut. We love you in Jesus' name.